preaching, you just wait till everyone stops talking and doing things, and that means it's your turn. You don't have to worry about much else. I really do appreciate the invitation to be here. When Shane was talking to me earlier, he's like, where do you preach? And the answer is really simple. Anywhere that'll let me. That's not really a complicated process for me. And I'm glad that you let me. The work of working our way through the gospel and through the Bible's message is incredibly important for all of us. And what I would like to do for us tonight is to pause for a second in the space of this excellent series and think about a few things that I think will help us in a couple of ways build a better appreciation for each of the participants in the Bible's story. We're going to approach this conversation tonight like a conversation. That means there's going to be space for questions. It's not a sermon. It's me talking and you talking and us thinking about what God says. As we do that, though, we're going to go through a few steps. We've got to get to a place where we can talk about the same things. And what I would like something. Over the years, you may have heard someone talking about the inspiration of the Bible and say things like, the Bible is inspired because there are 66 books. And of those 66 books, there are 40 or so authors. And how else could that happen without the hand of inspiration to guide a book that could be so intertwined together without God's hand having been part of it? And so you probably have heard something like that before, and if you haven't, well, then you could say you heard it tonight and you can add it to your repertoire of things to think about. But I want you to ponder that for a moment and start thinking about what that then means. Because if we say the Bible is inspired, and we say that God gave it to us, and we say that a hallmark of its inspiration is that God's hand is seen throughout of it, those hallmarks can become important for us. And I want you to raise your hand right now. This is like part of the interrogation process of a Bible class where I interrogate you for information and you cough it up unwillingly. If you have ever seen anything made by the company Hallmark in visual media form, please raise your hand. See, everybody has seen a Hallmark movie, right? Now, if I ask you the question, inside of a Hallmark movie, when there is an anticipated romance, like, they're about to get together, but there's always something that gets in the way. The conflict before the resolution. Do you see that in every Hallmark movie ever? Like, everything's so great. And it's that third party that comes in talking to the coffee shop owner who is talking to the person from the big city, and they say, it's going to be great, and then it's not. Right? That happens every single one of them. And there's a part of me that kind of doesn't like Hallmark movies. And my wife's not here, so I can admit this. There's actually a tiny little part of me that does like Hallmark movies. Not for the reason that she likes them. See, I like Hallmark movies to find out when they don't follow the standard plot. Like, I'm waiting for the thing that doesn't look like all the other things. I want them to subvert the story and do something unexpected. But for most of us, what we want is the expected. We want all that resolution. We want the emotional release of, yay, everything worked out like I thought it was, and the bad person isn't that bad. Actually, they were just misunderstood. We want all of that. In part, I will believe that the reason for that is we're a little hardwired. We are built and designed in a way to appreciate and understand patterns. Because just as a Hallmark movie functions because of its accessibility and repeatability and it's familiar to us, the Bible does that too. It's accessible and repeatable. And this is the part where you go, Mr. Preacher, you got a bad joke. A hallmark of biblical teaching, see hallmark, it's stuck in your head now. A hallmark of biblical teaching is those repeats. Because it's a unified story. Because it is something that has structure. And our theme for this series is overcoming in many senses. That's the big theme of things, right? And I know it's tiny. I made that on purpose. Don't be surprised. Like, hey, I'll do that. That's so I know where it is, but it's still a black screen. That's for me, not for you, but if you can see it, cool. The theme of the series has us considering how is it that individuals that are unique, special, and made in the image of God accomplish amazing things, like Abraham or Abram. How do they do what they do in such trying circumstances that don't make sense to them and don't make sense to us? And why are there so many surprises in a story that's so amazing? Because He's someone who's called to leave. Not just once. It happens to him more than once, where he's called to leave where he is to go do something different. How does that work out? Well, I want you to think about something as we get deeper into this. Since I already told this once, I'm going to tell it again. The Bible is a unified story, right? But it's not just about inspiration like you've heard before. See, the Bible is a unified story, but at every single page, it leads us to Jesus. See, if you already understand that it's about inspiration, now you could add the real layer that it's not about inspiration because it's actually just one story. And very often, maybe you do this, and I know I've done this before. When we're reading the Bible, we do the standard literary leap, and we place ourselves in the story. You ever see that happen? You watch any little kid who has watched any other show, and immediately they start mimicking the behavior of the protagonist. That's why little kids dress up as superheroes, because they're mimicking the protagonist. We do that. We put ourselves in the story and we say, well, I'm going to be this person. I'm Moses today. Newsflash, you're not Moses. Second newsflash, it's totally okay not to be Moses. You don't need to be Moshe. I don't need to be him either. But I do need to learn from him as he shows me what it's like to understand Jesus, because the Bible is a unified story that should lead me to Jesus. Further, the Hebrew Bible, what we sometimes call the Old Testament, begins with a whisper, but it builds to a roar. The whisper in Genesis is this little visual story of life in the garden that gets damaged and destroyed. But the Christian Bible, which we sometimes refer to as the New Testament, shows Jesus to transform us to be like Jesus. So again, if you put all those things together and you work through them, you remind yourself that the Bible then is a unified story that leads us to Jesus. The Hebrew Bible is a whisper that builds to a roar concerning the Messiah, the Anointed One, Jesus. And the Christian Bible, the New Testament, shows us Jesus to transform us to be like him. And you think about, how's that going to help me overcome and understand Abraham? It's absolutely going to do that. It's going to do that in pretty amazing and specific ways. So thinking about it more deeply now, understand this. When we think about Abraham, Abram, think about him leaving home and family and how some of that imagery would play out in your head. Think about the story in the back of your mind for a moment, but I want you to start where it actually begins. It doesn't actually begin when we meet Abram, who's a mess in some ways, just like you and me. He's not perfect. It actually begins in the garden. Because if the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus, think about this event in the garden. Man who is made in the image of God. We sometimes think about man's name being Adam or Adam, which is connected to Adamah, which is the ground where he's pulled out of. But really his first name is that he is an image of God. That word image, by the way, is the same word that we find in the Old Testament often for a statue. Because that's the idea of it. It looks like this. Man is made in the image of God. Now, think about this biblically and structurally. Maybe think about John in John chapter 1 and verse 1 and John chapter 1 and verse 14. Well, who is Jesus? Jesus is the Word. And the Word was existing or preeminent before creation. The Word became flesh in John 1:14 and dwelt among men. See, Christ then is the image of God. So man made in the image of God, who is asked and then forced to leave the garden because of his behavior. So he leaves home and familiarity and goes to somewhere else. Is eventually pushed, like you and me, to encounter Christ, who is the image of God. But then you and I, we are encouraged, admonished, and pushed to become or be transformed into the image of Christ, who is the image of God. In many ways, that is the Bible story as a big chunk of things. Now your brain's going, wait a minute, how does this have to do with Abraham again? Like, what is this all about? Let that season in for a little bit and think about a few things when you think about what does it mean now to be an overcomer, and what does it mean to really overcome the idea of leaving home and leaving family and going to somewhere else. Because in reality, the somewhere else that Abraham, Avram, and even Adam go to is to lead us home. It's not to go to the other place. It's to actually learn what we need to learn and grow in the ways we need to grow so that we can come home again. The Bible then is full of biblical illustrations, stories, components, and bits and pieces. And all those stories you kind of understand in the Old Testament are all designing this idea to teach us about what it means to draw closer and more tightly to God again. Because like Adam and like Abraham, we need to go home. We just don't necessarily know what home looks like. We don't necessarily understand that where we're at isn't actually home. Because consider again how often the stories of God's people are simply echoes of the past, played out again in the story space of our mind. But the melody of those songs, the melody of the song of Abraham, the melody of the song of Moses, Noah, the patriarchs, Ruth and Boaz, the rising and falling of Israel, the tide of humanity that is God's people is always Christ. In 2 Corinthians in chapter 5, the Bible reads for you and I, we walk by faith and not by sight. The world of Abraham and the world around us is full of insecurity and uncertainty, and we have to learn to walk in a way that makes it feel okay. So think about the next thing on the list of my suggestions of consideration. Like you're suggesting I think a lot. Thinking's hard. It is. I'll wear you out. So think about Abraham. Think about the unified story of the Bible and how every single story actually leads us to Christ. And think about the first time you really appreciated that you were homesick. Maybe you were at a camp somewhere. Maybe you were overseas in work or service capacities. Maybe you were just away from home that first night in a sleepover and you're like, I wish I was back in my bed. And I wish mom tucked me in. You see, it's not so much that you miss your home per se. And this is a secret, it's not even so much that you miss mom. I know mom's like, please cut it out. We want them to miss mom. They do miss mom, but that doesn't necessarily produce the homesickness. You're homesick because you're not comfortable where you are. If you're out in the woods somewhere, you're homesick because it doesn't sound like home. If you're on the mountain somewhere, you're homesick because the sky pushes on you differently. If you're overseas, you're homesick because your meal wasn't the same as the meal at home. It wasn't that it wasn't good, and the stars aren't wonderful, and the skies aren't beautiful. It's just unfamiliar. It's different. So it is for Adam outside the garden. So it is for Abraham as he goes step by step. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8, the Bible reads, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. A component of the idea of understanding what it's like to overcome successfully is really more simplified as this. We want to build our faith, which is trust, by the way. But faith is not something you simply study. It's something you allow to grow. You practice it. And really, if you want your faith to grow, pay attention to Hebrews 11 and verse 8 again. That you let your faith grow by practice, by obedience, by doing the thing that you're asked to do. That's how you build faith. I know it seems kind of simplified down, but it's practical. It's functional. And guess what? It's actually how it works. It's something where you put the effort in and you do the things. So if you want your faith to grow, be obedient. That's the real heart of the underlying idea of how it is you can overcome when you're asked to do something uncomfortable. Maybe even think about it this way. He's probably seen stories, heard in lectures, been in classes outside of the church and within the church where success exists outside your comfort zone, where you've got to do something a little bit different. Well, Abraham is a key illustration. That's one of those regular stories where we hear that repeat and say, okay, yeah, that's what he's doing. He's stepping out of his comfort zone to do something God asked him to do because he needs to do it. Well, the story is more complicated than even just that. There's some nuggets of truth underneath the story of Abraham that I think are really important, because he really is, perhaps, in the New Testament, particularly when he's pulled forth that generation, one of the few highlights of what it would look like to be truly faithful. Like, everyone uses his life in that regard. The Bible identifies him quickly as a man of faith in Genesis 15 and verse 6. Throughout the history of Israel, Abraham is viewed as the father of the faithful. He's kind of central to their story. Isaiah calls Abraham, in Isaiah 51 and verse 1, the rock from which Israel was hewn, and the quarry from which we were dug. In the covenant that God made with Abraham, it even anticipated the future arrival of the Anointed One, or the Christ, the seed through which the world will be blessed. And Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16 tells us that. So here's the story of Abraham that really drives home. See, that's what we're getting to. It says on the chart there, right? The story. I want you to think about what happens first. And this occurs for us right now in Genesis 12 and verse 1. Textually, in the language there, the Lord Adonai, the Lord says to Abraham, in essence, get up and go. Just go. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. That simple act of willful obedience is one of the watersheds for human endeavor. Human history really shifts with that simple behavior. Prior to that, the stories that go from the garden to Abraham match the gradual winding down of successive copies. You ever done, like, back when I was in school, back when Methuselah was walking around for you young people, back when I was in school, everything was copied on this thing called a mimeograph machine. This was before copiers existed. And for whatever reason, in my elementary school particularly, it was the awesome thing to get called out to go work the mimeograph. I think I've lost brain cells because of it, like the smells and everything, but I could totally smell it right now. It's like a hand crank copier machine. But over time, what happens to the mimeograph, like it does with anything else, is it gets more blurry. The original plates, they decay, they get more smeary, and every copy is less. So pay attention to the hallmark of biblical teaching where the stories repeat. And you have a story that starts in the garden. Adam and Eve, everything's great. Adam and Eve, second count of willful disobedience, because the angels were the first count, the serpent. Second count of willful disobedience among man. Everyone repeats the behavior. There are rare exceptions, but downward the spiral goes. Then we find not a perfect man, but an obedient man in Abraham. And it begins as a walk of obedience in a very simplified manner. Get up and go. And the text is going to use two simple ideas to teach us a truth that is now timeless. So just like that Hallmark movie, it will repeat for us. And that's the idea of a tent and an altar. Here's my second question. I'm interrogating for the questions where you get to answer later. How many of you at some point in your life have spent a night, just one night, in a tent you pitched yourself? So most of us, right? The rest of you get out and do it. Just go do it one night. Like, if you want to be bougie about it, have someone else put the tent up for you and survive the night, but go sleep in a tent. It's a formative experience. You should do it at least once. But the Bible uses a term here that is pretty specific, because a tent is not built, it is pitched. And actually in the language itself, it's pretty simplified. It actually, this is a neat thing about Hebrew and about all languages. Translation is an art. I think in the Bible record, the Hebrew language actually only uses about 2,000 words to form our entire Old Testament text. So out of 2,000 words, which are repeated a lot, they build our Old Testament scriptures. So the way it's rendered in the text there is actually simply saying Abraham tented. But we'll say things like Abraham moved his tent or pitched his tent. But basically, he set up his tent every night as he's moving along. And as he goes, he takes it down, he puts it up. And God gives him land, but he really only camps out on it. And I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of time actually outdoors in tents and hammocks. And you don't feel like you own anything. Like, I'm a hammock guy, so basically I'm a bear taco. Think about it that way. Like, bears come by, like, oh yeah, sweet. Look at that taco hanging up there for me. But you don't have any structure, no safety, no security. Abraham pitches a tent. In this case, you see maybe even references to it throughout the text, but really he exists mainly between Bethel and Ai. And in that setting, he calls on the name of the Lord. And it's really surprising, because at that point, how does he do that? How does he know who the Lord is? This is new. In Exodus 6 and verse 3, later we learn, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. How is it that Abraham calls on the name of the Lord, but doesn't actually know God by much of anything? See, that word already existed, but it's not so much that he knows the name, but it's what it implies about God that he's learning. He's learning there's something about God that goes beyond the seen realm, that reaches into the unseen realm, that allows him to trust enough, to trust him to tent in the wild spaces without any kind of security. Abraham dwells in this tent phase, even though he doesn't have anything permanent, because it's a further sign of his trust. He believes. His faith makes him obey. And by the way, here's a little neat thing for you. Anytime in the Old Testament where you see things like faith, fear, trust, and that whole spectrum of ideas between like, I fear this, to I believe and I trust this, it's actually all from the same set of Hebrew words. It's all the same kind of concept played over again. And it's what context around it helps us understand the difference between fearfulness and faithfulness, because you trust something enough. Here's the simple illustration that ties together with Abraham. You ever seen those big machines that destroy automobiles and like grind up metal and stuff? Like, it's like a wood chipper for like metal. I don't know about you. Like, I totally get fascinated by machines that do amazing things. And so a wood chipper destroys trees. Well, they have machines that do that with metal. I'm afraid of that thing, but I'm also fascinated by it, because it's able to take cars and grind them up into bits. Big, massive chunks of things. So I not only am afraid of it, but I also trust it. Because when they're running, and I've been close, I get close. Like, I trust this will tear this car up, but it won't explode and tear me up. So at the same time, I'm fearful of it, but I have faith in it. So it is with a mighty God who asked Abram, who becomes Abraham, and Sarai, but becomes Sarah for our English translations. They trust, but they also are afraid because of the mighty power. Now, all that, again, helps us maybe get closer to the idea of what it means to overcome when we leave home and family. So Abraham builds tents for a large chunk of his life. He pitches them over and over again. And by now, he has learned, we're about in chapter 13, chapter 14 of Genesis, as we're kind of thinking about this story, that he has the deed to the land. It's his land. But the only thing he actually builds in the promised land, in this promised space, is an altar to worship God. For our purposes right now, you're thinking about Abraham, how does he overcome? How do I overcome? And more importantly, how do I see Jesus in his overcoming? The tent teaches us about the earthly side of Abraham, but the altar helps us understand as Abraham looks towards God. See, an altar, unlike a tent, that's solid, that's enduring, it's structural, it's built, it's not going to be moved around, it's going to stay in its place. Abraham dwells in a tent in his active obedience, in a land that his descendants will inherit, but he's already acknowledging his spiritual inheritance by building an altar and saying, God, his tov is good with him in all circumstances. So when we seek, this is the application side just a little bit, to live by trust in the God of Israel, we're actually journeying just like he did. But not just like he did. See, for now we're tent dwellers, but one day we're going to be close to the altar. And as we pitch our tent, we're actually building our altar. And our journey kind of progresses like Abraham. You see, now here's the thing. You got Abraham, tent builder, altar builder. Now what about Jesus? Remember, every story in the Bible is supposed to be unified about Jesus. At least my theory about that is. You're welcome to disagree with me all you like. What does Jesus do? He leaves his home. And where does he go? A place he's never really been before. He's the creator and sustainer. But he learns what? What does the Bible say he learns? This is where you can start answering questions, by the way. What does Jesus learn? Obedience, right? He learns obedience by existing as a man and as part of creation. So he learned the very thing that makes the key mark or hallmark about Abraham by leaving his home and, by the way, his family. You ever heard the phrase Godhead before? Like the Godhead? Do you know that's basically the same thing textually as saying the God family? And the relationship of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, in short, can be described as this. They eternally proceed from one another. So God breathes out, God breathes out, God breathes out. They breathe each other out in an internal context. Jesus leaves that, forsakes the glory of the divine context, whatever that entails. The Bible doesn't tell us everything about it. To be obedient, to achieve a goal that matches back to our original thematic tie-in. If you think about man that's made in the image of God, Christ, who is the image of God, who became the image of Christ, that's you and me. When we allow our faith to grow and mature as it ought to, Jesus accomplishes that for us. So then you think about, okay, now I've got some ideas. I got a Bible story. See, Bible storytelling, it's a powerful tool. I've got a concept. The concept, Abraham overcame, right? He left family, home, he left Ur, he left Haran, left all those things at various points in his life that were familiar to him to go to a place he didn't understand. That's you and mine. And by the way, if you want a little biblical connection in the New Testament, where does Jesus say we lay up our treasures? Heaven, right? Can we take our tabernacle with us? Can we pitch our tent in heaven? No, where does our tent stay? Our earthly dwellings. That's earthbound stuff, right? We don't take that with us. We don't engage in that way. Further, how does the New Testament describe disciples of Jesus in the present context? What are some of the translation terms used to say, this is how you see your time here on earth? Sojourners. Another translation, I think it's the King James, it says we're strangers. Right? You ever meet a stranger before? Yeah, everybody's strange. Like you've met a bunch of strangers. This is a fact that I say this to my kids all the time. I'm going to say it to you. Everybody's weird. Absolutely, everyone's weird. Because only one person is normal and it's not you or me. Ergo, everybody's weird. So everyone's a stranger. We're just strange in different ways. But yet in the Bible sense, we're super strange in that we don't blend in with the areas around us for all kinds of ways. But I think textually and fundamentally, there's one truth that we have to accept about Abraham that's true about us. We are strangers here and strange because we understand we're not staying here. And we move and talk that way too. You ever sing about wanting to go to heaven? Yes, you do. Those are in the songbooks. I see the songbooks there. It's a shake and nod moment. So when you think about the story of Abraham, this is where we get to our key questions. This is where the interrogation continues. I want you to think about and answer this question. In the story of Abraham, as he leaves family and he leaves home, what do you like about that story? Because that's what the Bible is, stories, right? We don't like story because the Bible is history and history is factual. It's still a story. It just happens to be a true one. We call that nonfiction, right? So what do you like about this part of the narrative of the Bible? And the story of Abraham, or Avram, that is interesting to you or just really cool? Is that a Bible class question? Well, it is now. So what do you like about the Bible, about this story?
He had the courage to do it.
He had the courage to do something weird. Like, that's not how it goes in the context of that entire world space. I have a friend, Bill, who in college we called him Bilbert, but now he's Bill. He's William. But Bilbert lives up in Stop, Kentucky, a small little county up in Kentucky, where there are members of the congregation where he worships that have literally never left their county. Like they were born in that county, in the home in which they reside, and they will probably be buried in that same county. That's an uncommon thing in our culture today, to have that level of stick-to-itiveness to a region. But in the time of this era, people don't travel. It's really hard to travel. So a lot of courage and this willingness to go, but also to go without any kind of sensible plan, right? Just get up and go. Go now. What else do you like about it? I'm content to just stand here. Like, the outcome for me is exactly the same. So if you don't answer questions.
Christ-like obedience.
Christ-like obedience.
Know God before we knew God, or he had been exposed to God, because his family were idol worshipers. How did he accept that call immediately?
Yeah, you think about, the Bible shows us some inner thought spaces of some of the prophets, where God speaks to them and he reveals himself to them. And I would love for this to take place. We're getting close to the holiday season where all the little cherubims, the cherubims are going to be sold, the little cute little angels. I would love for them to sell actual representation of the visualization of angels in the Old and New Testament. It would freak everybody out. Like, I can't even, like, some of that's really chaotic. And that's how God revealed himself to prophets. With Abraham, we don't get that inner monologue event. We know he's told. The text is using terminology that this is a spoken, he verbalized it to him in some way. But what's his background? How does he know it's God? How do you know that this God of all the gods is the God of gods? He just obeys. And so his willingness to trust level, I'll be fair, it exceeds mine. Like, I don't trust anything. Like, I double check everything, like double check straps. Standard dad move, you tighten the truck down, I'm clamping. Oh yeah, it's good, it's good. I checked it 4 times. Anything else? We got more questions too, so don't feel like this is the only question we can deal with. What else? There's something else. There's other cool things in the story to you. I'll just tell you mine. I love that he's staying in a tent. Like, that's totally like low key for me. Like maintaining that tent, it's a lot less work than maintaining a house or a home or all the other stuff to it. Low weight, low cost. I'm down with that. Like, I love that part of it. How about this? And we've already kind of hinted at it. What questions do you want answered? You realize the Bible is absolutely packed with mystery? Let me give you one, and it'll help you set the stage for this. Does the Bible tell us that the Spirit dwells within us? Like, literally in literal text, does it say that phrase? Yes, God dwells within us, right? Does it say how? Does it literally define for us how? Actually doesn't. It just says it happens. Do we fight about the process in the middle? Absolutely true. We absolutely fight about that part of it. Probably shouldn't, because that's a mystery that isn't revealed, and we should just accept it. Because it's a mystery. There's lots of mysteries. There's a big one, the Messiah, that isn't revealed till later. But the way the Bible's laid out, it's not your typical mystery where it doesn't get revealed until the last chapter. Like, it's getting revealed pretty early on. But what questions do you want answered? What's some of the mysteries or things you're like, I really would like to know what's going on there? Yeah. You know, the Old Testament is full of one truth. All the families are just like our families. I always picture the patriarchs, especially the Israel patriarchs, driving from California to Kansas in the back of a Pinto with bubble windows. And think about how that family fought in the back of that green station wagon. That's because that's how my family traveled, and that's what we did. And it's not a pleasant experience, right? If you have siblings, you've been punched in the gut by a sibling, purposefully or accidentally. It just happens. I want to know how the rest of the family thinks about it. Because how would you respond to a family member who says, you know what? God has told me that I'm going to go to Malawi. I need to go to Malawi. It's a place, by the way. It's in Africa. And I'm going to do a couple of things. How many grannies would be like, have you lost your mind? What else? What other mysteries are good for you?
His faith surely didn't start the day the Lord spoke to him. Interesting to know the genesis of that great faith.
Yeah, he didn't wake up one day and say, you know what? I'm going to obey today. And we pointed this out. Abraham is not a perfect person. None of the patriarchs of the Bible are. In most of the cases, and this is a side note, every single major person from Adam to Jesus is trying to help us understand that we need Jesus to fix the parts that are missing in all of those people. Why is David a great king? He's a great king in part because he shows us we need more than David. Why is Solomon so wise? In part because he shows us that Solomon isn't wise enough on his own. Same thing is true of Moses, Abraham, Noah, even some of the specific worthies that have very little negative about them whatsoever. They still teach us that same truth that without Jesus, it's not enough. Any other questions you want answered? Like, this is a great thing to do with the Bible. Like, hey, what's missing in my brain? Sometimes there's actual answers to questions. A lot of times you're like, I still don't know. Because mysteries are part of the revelation of God. This is where it shifts. Since it's a uniform story about Jesus, what does this story, this narrative, this historical component, the record that God has selected from the life of these people for us, teach us about Jesus or God? And by the way, your answer can be different from your person next to you's answer. Because it can teach us more than one thing. And it doesn't even have to be worded the same way. That's totally cool. Again, I can sit here for a long time, and nothing changes for me if you don't answer questions.
He was willing to leave his most comfortable place for redeem himself and live in an outfit from the Lord to go with him so young. And he knows where he's going, and in the process he has one like all.
Right. Sometimes we say it's not the destination but the journey. For Abraham, it was absolutely not the destination, it was the journey. Because the land never really made any impact for him. It wasn't for him. It wasn't even necessarily for his descendants per se.
He had promises to do.
Yeah. It's like, I got it written down in the ledger. I got my deed. It says right here that my descendants, like the stars, baby, like the stars. Did he see the stars? That were his descendants? Not in the sense of immediacy. Will he see the results of it? Sure. But not in the way that we see things. Not until the spiritual realm kind of comes into more direct contact with the physical realm. One of the things I see that's taught to us about God, about Jesus in this, is that when God prods us, he provides for us. Get up and go. Even in the midst of his failures, Abraham is still provided for. His obedience consistently drives him to one destination. What does God need of me next? And he matures in it. He's even willing to do things that, quite frankly, most of us wouldn't be willing to do. How many of us are going to, engage in the kind of faithfulness that has a life that we are responsible for, that is a blessing and a gift to us, that says, yeah, I'll give that up. See, he overcomes because he trusts. Because faith is more than just obedience, and is also more than just fear. It's trust. You trust that God will provide. All right, time's going to scooch us forward. Last shifting of the story. What is God teaching me at the end? It's a little bit different, right? Just shift in the questions.
I think at some point, I don't know that I've ever seen this, but it's just when it says go, that's exactly what Jesus told us as well to do. Is you're supposed to go. And I think when we think about the concept of, I feel like I'm being called to go to this place, to go and do this thing, we get kind of suspicious about it. Of course, I mean, there's probably a good reason for that, but there's a legitimate concept where God is ordering things for you to be in a certain place or be in a certain place for a specific reason.
Get up and go. Like the way the Hebrew is constructed, the original language, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of it, it ties specifically, that same word is used there that's used for go in the New Testament. It's the same word structure, the same arrangement. It's a command. It's not like, hey, if you think about it, hey, maybe could you? Go. And that's why I really kind of shifted a little bit, say it's get up and go. Like immediacy is part of the idea of it. And so one of the things that God is teaching us is that far too often, with far too much lackadaisical behavior, we're kind of lazy and set in our ways. We establish our comfort zone and never leave it. You think about the people you evangelize. They look just like you, don't they? However you think you look. And if the congregation here was flooded with people who didn't look like you, would you be uncomfortable? Yes, you would. Oh, no, I'd be totally fine. You're not fine when they're singing a different language than you are, even though it's the same tune, but the words are weird. I can tell you that, like, it's really not right. Because you're not fine when everybody is singing, but nobody is on key, because they've never had singing lessons before. That's really bad. This is my ear. That's on the good side, which is the good side over here. This is the bad side. So I think there's at least 3 things we should remember as like takeaway truths from the text. The big 3 things that are key points. Number 1, if you want to be comfortable leaving home and family because you are called to do that as a disciple of Jesus, especially even if your family fights against you and your commitment to God, is to simply follow God. When God leads, you obey. Second truth, simplified down for all of us. God is always first in things. That's the center of everything. If it's the centerpiece of our Bible, and I believe that it is, then it should also be the centerpiece of our decision process and how we successfully transition, because we're in the same reality. We're just like Moses in that sense, where we're called to leave where we are and be transformed to become whom God needs us to be. Because that's the process that repeats the Bible. And finally, I think this is probably the most salient or important reason, kind of point to catch. We're strangers here. Live like it. Think like it. Realize that being a stranger here isn't a bad thing. How many of you have taken a vacation to go see someplace you don't live? This is a raise your hand on it. You have either chosen to do so or you've been forced to do so because your parents or your whatever made you do it. Why? Well, we just need to get away. Well, you want to go see things or go do things because you need to leave home. And you might leave home to go to college or to start a family or to do something the gospel needs you to do or to help in a community or simply to be obedient to God. And I think understanding that better can help refine our perspective away from thinking so much about what everyone tells us should matter and learning, hey, you know what really matters? Where I'm going to and the journey I'm on to get there. A friend that some of you may know, I won't go into a longer story, used to say regularly that he was homesick for a place he had never been. And I want to encourage you to live a life that thinks in that same way. To be homesick for the place you have never been. Because this place should never feel comfortable, so comfortable that it feels like home. It doesn't mean you can't have great relationships. It doesn't mean your family isn't important to you. It doesn't mean you don't build connections with your family. It means there's something more important than the tent that you pitch every day. It's the altar upon which you offer your sacrifice to God. And if you notice in Romans chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2, the real focus of our transformation isn't simply being no longer conformed to this world. It's so that our day-to-day life, every ounce of ourselves, can be offered up as a sacrifice of service. That would be our worship. So I would encourage you to live in a way that no longer could you say, well, this is my church behavior and this is my work behavior, or it's my secular life and my spiritual life. That you're simply living as a disciple who's a stranger here, but's heading home. If you have more questions about this text or other stuff, you're welcome to ask me. I think the official end of my class is when I'm done. And so I'm basically done for tonight. But I think we can understand that we've been called to overcome. And all my contact information should be hiding right there. So that's my phone number. That's my general connection on most social media things. And so you can generally find me that way if you want to communicate that way. But I want to encourage you again, just live like a stranger, because home is way better than here. Just think about that big picture. From garden till now, man who is made in the image of God, that's you and me, will be able to be around Christ, who is the image of God, who understands you and me, in a garden beyond compare. Thanks.